It was unprovoked, but this is what Russian President Vladimir Putin unleashed on Ukraine.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine has left over 100,000 dead and millions of people displaced. But Vladimir Putin's war goes far beyond rockets and bombs. This war is also an energy war.
Electricity bills are soaring.
Work is continuing in Ukraine to restore electricity.
Parts of Europe are going dark.
That has resulted in really bad disaster.
We're at a moment in history now where energy has become a weapon.
But we've been here before. The Arab-Israeli War of 1973 sent an energy shock reverberating around the globe.
The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries imposed its boycott and within a year raised prices more than 300%.
At the height of the embargo, 500,000 people were thrown out of work.
So what lessons can we learn from an energy crisis 50 years ago? When Russian troops invaded Ukraine in February 2022, the West imposed sanctions. Russia responded by choking off its gas supplies to Europe.
Russia could single-handedly push Europe into recession.
Vladimir Putin is holding the trump card.
Europe is facing a worsening energy crisis ahead of winter.
But holding energy to ransom isn't a new trick. In 1973, the Arab members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, stopped selling oil to America and other Western nations in a bid to stop them supporting Israel in the Arab-Israeli War. The embargo caused immediate economic pain around the world, but it didn't have the impact OPEC was looking for.
The lessons from the 1970s oil shocks, such as the oil embargo in the early part of the 1970s, is that they don't work.
By the early 70s, 83% of America's oil imports came from the Middle East, creating an unhealthy dependency.
Energy security is part of the energy policy for any country in the world, but before 1973, the US didn't seem to be very much preoccupied by this particular part of the energy policy. Nobody was so much thinking about the potential negative outcomes of this import dependency.
When war broke out, news headlines were dominated by the Arab oil producers' attempts to use this dependency to force a change in America's foreign policy.
They will reduce oil production by 5% a month until the Israelis withdraw from occupied territories.
For Western governments, it was a potentially devastating blow. Energy economist Philip Verleger worked as a consultant during the crisis and advised numerous administrations.
The embargo occurred at a point where the economy was already fragile. The country was confronting serious inflation. The Arab embargo in 1973 then exacerbated the inflationary impact and tipped everything into a serious economic crisis.
Energy had become a weapon.
The world economy was utterly reliant on oil in the 1970s. We were at a moment of inflection when the Middle Eastern producers were ready to seize power, in a sense, over the oil markets back from the West, particularly the United States.
Up until the 1950s, America had been self-sufficient in energy production. And while it remained a big oil producer, as the century progressed, it simply didn't make enough for its own needs. The balance of power in global oil markets had shifted, and America's reliance on imports from the Middle East meant its economy paid the price.
The US economy was facing tremendous difficulties. There was deficit of oil and oil products. There was also a deficit of gas. The resource-rich countries, they suddenly realized that they can affect the situation by restricting oil supplies.
1973 dramatized U.S. dependence on foreign oil.
During the embargo, American oil imports from OPEC fell by nearly half. Over the next few years, the price quadrupled.
The impact of the embargo and the higher oil prices was felt globally. By the end of 1974, we were in a pretty severe recession.
But despite the bleak outlook, some spotted a path through the crisis.
One great energy economist, Moritz Edelman, a professor at MIT, was quoted in The Economist at the time saying that if the Arabs don't sell us oil, somebody else will.
Edelman was right. America might have paid more, but the oil still flowed.
The Arabs refused to sell oil to a handful of countries like the United States for their support of Israel, but they continued to sell oil to other countries. And so once the oil made its way to marketplace, those cargoes were redirected at a higher price, with middlemen profiting along the way to the markets that needed that oil. Prices went up, but the United States did get the oil it needed.
Just 5 months in, OPEC lifted its embargo without the US changing its stance on the conflict, or running out of oil.
And the reason is oil is a fungible global commodity. Every barrel of oil is connected with every other barrel of oil, even though there's some minor differences in grade and refining qualities. Basically, oil will get to market as long as there's demand.
50 years on, the West is learning the same thing again. Despite attempting to switch energy supplies, Europe is still getting oil from Russia, only via India, where it's refined from crude and sold at a higher price.
Russia is actually making more money from oil today than it was before the war.
Hi, I'm Christian Onder, the Economist European Economics Editor. We've written a lot about the energy crisis over the past few months and how it may affect the world. If you'd like to know more, click the link.
The fact Russia is now making more money from oil highlights another lesson the world has failed to learn from the oil crisis of the 70s.
Diversity of supplies. Being overly reliant on a single supplier, the way that Germany relied on Russia for 55% of its natural gas a couple of years ago, that is a sure ticket to lack of security. So diversify your suppliers.
The oil shock of 1973 spurred a change in the way the US government in particular viewed energy security.
Let this be our national goal. At the end of this decade, in the year 1980, the United States will not be dependent on any other country for the energy we need.
America began to increase domestic oil production and started down the long road back to energy self-sufficiency. But Europe didn't follow suit. In 2021, a quarter of all its energy came from Russia, leaving the continent badly dependent on a hostile state.
The energy shock that we're living through now really began with natural gas. In the run-up to and during the Ukraine war, Russia squeezed Europe very badly, cutting off most of its supplies via pipeline to Europe of natural gas.
In 2021, the EU imported approximately 83% of its natural gas, around 45% of which came from Russia. As Russia throttles Europe's gas supplies in retaliation to sanctions, supply shortages sent prices skyrocketing around the globe. And as Vladimir Putin threatens to cut oil production in response to Western embargoes and price caps, there are fears the price of oil could also get out of control.
Now, there's some obvious similarities between the oil shocks of the 1970s and the energy crisis we're going through today. Gasoline prices are high, oil supplies are tight, and presidents and prime ministers in the West are under pressure to curb inflation, the scourge of the age once again.
But today's energy market is a very different beast from 50 years ago.
Because we're hyper-connected now globally, that means that shocks in one place are transmitted much more throughout the world. That means that we're more likely to see a globalized shock.
In the crisis of the 70s, gas was a useful alternative to oil. This time around, it's part of the problem.
Russia exercised natural gas as a weapon against Europe by choking supplies and is threatening to do the same with oil.
Despite the recent drops in wholesale prices, consumer European gas costs surged to unprecedented levels in 2022. 177% higher than they were just 2 years ago. Europe is trying to reduce its reliance on Russian gas, but only 2 countries have completely halted imports: Britain, which gets most of its gas from Norway, and Lithuania, which has replaced its Russian gas with supplies from America. But Russian gas is still finding its way to Europe.
For some years, Europe will still continue to use some Russian gas, but the bigger share of Europe's gas increasingly will come from imports by sea. That is LNG, liquefied natural gas, where that natural gas is frozen at source and put on a special ship and sent to be regasified on European shores.
But the West's search for alternative energy suppliers has had unintended consequences.
One of the tensions that's been exposed by the energy crisis of 2022 is the hypocrisy of Europe basically gobbling up the world's LNG, paying heavy premiums to make sure its own markets were well supplied.
Western countries with deep pockets are outbidding poorer ones for fuel. Countries like Bangladesh, Thailand, and Pakistan have been priced out of the global LNG market, cutting them off from the energy they need. And more importantly, the global south stands to suffer disproportionately if the West ignores another lesson. The 1973 oil embargo not only showed America the risks of relying on imported oil, but also the need to invest in other sources of energy.
One of the outcomes of that was a massive switch to coal.
Other countries followed suit.
I think the Germans would not, and the Polish and other countries in Europe would have not used as much coal had this policy not happened. The French, on the other hand, moved rapidly ahead with nuclear power. You saw the beginning of solar power across the world.
For a few years, it looked like the world might be at the start of an energy transition.
It triggered some things that were positive, that is a move towards conservation, for example, fuel economy standards for cars in America, and some other policies that did have positive effect.
You might think a rise in energy prices would encourage a shift away from fossil fuels. But the oil shock of the 70s demonstrates it's not quite that simple. Despite investing in research into renewable energies, it was more profitable to develop technologies that made more efficient use of oil, rather than replace it altogether. Today, however, the stakes are much higher.
Today, the situation is much more urgent than it was in the 1970s. We have the climate threat, the urgency of action which the world has to make immediately.
The current transition from fundamentally fossil fuel-based energy towards something that comes after decarbonized energy would take decades and decades, but we don't have that time. So it's the first time in human history, because of climate change, we are accelerating that pace dramatically, trying to do it in a decade or two, and that is unprecedented. The bigger point here, especially as we think about climate change and dealing with the energy transition, is diversify off of fossil fuels and find alternatives in power generation. It can be a new generation of nuclear, wind, solar, geothermal.
But as winter approached, and it looked like the energy crisis could cause tens of thousands of extra deaths across Europe, and possibly more in 2024, governments were forced to look at immediate solutions.
There is a risk that the short-term measures taken by governments to cope with the energy shock, like relying more on coal in the short term in Europe to keep the lights on, or the kind of price subsidies that have been offered in a number of countries that actually end up encouraging more energy use. I think there is a risk that this will slow down the energy transition and could even lead us to go sideways or backwards for some years. That is the great danger.
Even with the added threat of environmental catastrophe, there is a risk the lessons of history will go unheeded.
The world has learned some lessons from the embargo of 1973, but at the same time, the depth of this understanding wasn't sufficient. Today, we do not have time to waste.
But despite the world's failure to fully acknowledge the existential threat, there remains hope.
The gift we can take from Russia's use of energy as an oil weapon is that it seems to have reminded the world, which is getting very complacent about the energy transition, that it's not just about climate, it's also about energy security and affordability, that our addiction to fossil fuels comes with a very heavy price. I'm Vijay Vaidiswaran. I'm the Global Energy and Climate Innovation Editor of The Economist. To see more of our coverage of geopolitics and energy, please click the link and don't forget to subscribe.